Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for taking time to join us today. The TRCM is pleased to be able to offer this webinar series, and we certainly hope that you enjoy the next hour of learning. The TEI webinar series is hosted by the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, and today's webinar, using Let's Talk Treaty in the Classroom, will be presented by me, Connie Wyatt Anderson, Treaty Education Initiative Facilitation Lead. So let's begin. In this webinar, we are going to provide a backgrounder. It's one of the Let's Talk Treaty radio programs. We're going to recap a particular thematic radio segment. Then we're going to use the themes that we explored in the Let's Talk Treaty program as a teaching tool. We are going to explore the Treaty Education Initiative lesson plans that link to that radio segment. That's our goal today, folks. So let's talk a bit about what Let's Talk Treaty is. Let's Talk Treaty is a 15-minute bi-weekly radio series aimed at gaining a deeper understanding of the Manitoba treaties. The show features Treaty Commissioner Loretta Ross, who welcomes special guests in order to engage in insightful and thought-provoking discussions on treaties and the treaty relationship. You can access all of the Let's Talk Treaty episodes, and they're growing, so I encourage you to visit our website constantly. You can access them on our website, and you can see the URL there at www.trcm.ca. And actually, if you click on our tab and you click on multimedia, you can access them there. What we're going to do today is take, as I already noted, one of the Let's Talk Treaty radio spots, and we are going to tie the theme with some of the lesson plans, some of the learning materials that make up the Treaty Education Initiative. What's the Treaty Education Initiative? It's a kindergarten to grade 12 public education strategy aimed at increasing the knowledge and understanding of treaties and the treaty relationship here in Manitoba. The initiative itself is fortified by a set of K-12 teachers' resource guides. You can see them on the top left there. There's a resource guide for each grade level from kindergarten to grade 12 here in Manitoba. They have clear curriculum links to Manitoba curricula. There are also other materials to help you teach about treaties and the treaty relationship that are part of the Treaty Education Initiative. That includes textual materials meant for teachers and students, manipulatives, videos, audio, posters. So all of this forms something that we call the kit, and it's a literal box, a curated box of information for you as a Manitoba teacher. So again, our goal, and again, you can see those teacher's guides, our goal is to take one of those, the theme that we're going to explore today in this webinar, and link it to some of the pre-existing learning activities that we have. So without any further ado, let's explore together, and we're going to listen to it. Episode 17. Episode 17 of Let's Talk Treaty is Canada's History magazine, the special issue on treaties, which they recently published with Mark Reid. Canada's History magazine is Canada's premier history magazine. It's a popular history magazine, and for many years, many of you may have known it as the Beaver magazine. So what we're going to do, we're going to listen to Loretta, we're going to be listening to Commissioner Ross, and Canada's History magazine, Mark Reid, talk about the special issue on treaties. So without any further ado, bear with me.
The following presentation is a paid-for program. The views and opinions given do not necessarily represent those of NCI-FM.
Hi, this is Loretta Ross, Treaty Commissioner of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, and I want to welcome everyone back to our show, Let's Talk Treaty, and it's a public education show with regard to treaties and understanding the treaties here in Manitoba. We talk about either have different guests or we talk about different initiatives that the Treaty Relations Commission is involved with in promoting awareness and understanding with regard to the treaties. And today we have a guest with us, Mark Reid, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Canada's History magazine. Mark is a graduate of Dalhousie University and the University of King's College. Mark has edited and contributed to 5 books including 3 national bestsellers. His tenure with Canada's History magazine has been nominated for more than 70 national and regional awards, including Magazine of the Year at the National Magazine Awards. Mark is a jurist for the Indigenous Arts and Stories competition and also sits on the advisory council of Red River College's Creative Communications Department. And Mark lives here in Winnipeg. Whiteout Winnipeg these days, right? So welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
For those listeners who perhaps are not so familiar with Canada's History magazine, maybe you can provide us with just a little bit of background about the magazine itself.
Well, certainly. One of the funny things about where I work is that normally I'll say, do you know Canada's history? And people will say no. And I say, do you remember the beaver? And people will say yes, because we originally started off in 1920 as the Beaver magazine, which was the in-house publication of the Hudson's Bay Company. And now we have, in 2010, changed the name, and now we're the National History magazine for Canada.
Wow. So this next issue, or this current issue, I guess, that's out there, is a joint initiative between your office and mine, so to speak. And you approached our office I think it was in the fall that we had initial talks about doing something about treaties itself. So maybe can you tell us from Canada History magazine perspective why you felt it was important to have a magazine devoted to treaties?
Well, certainly. I think really the best question is, why did we wait so long to do an issue about treaties and the treaty relationship? And that's the title of our joint publication, Treaties and the Treaty Relationship. You know, I think as a history magazine, you cannot begin to understand the history of Canada unless you have a complete understanding of the history of treaties and the context of treaties. Because everybody benefits from a greater understanding of how treaties were created, the points of view of the different parties in the treaties, and how they are still living documents that really should be guiding our thinking today.
And I think one of the unique aspects of this magazine is that it does provide a different perspective, because people will say, I know what the treaties are all about. And that perspective often is something that we've been taught either in the school systems or just generally, and that is, at least for the treaties in Manitoba, that they were a land exchange treaty, and everybody just leaves it at that. But there's more to it. And so the magazine takes it that extra step by providing a First Nation perspective, right, with respect to the treaties. And there's a number of treaties across the country, and it is a national magazine. So, I mean, I think you did a great job to cover the treaties across Canada, but to also provide that different perspective.
Well, if we did a great job, it's because of your guidance as the co-editor, Loretta. You were just crucial to the success of the magazine for bringing that perspective and reminding us constantly, because we are not, at Canada's History, experts on treaties, and we're learning just as much as our readers are. I've been doing this for 10 years now, and this issue was really an eye-opener for me. You know, I think a lot of non-Indigenous, non-First Nations people think in terms of buying and selling. You sell your house, right. You sell your land, and that misconception about the very basis of a treaty and what exactly First Nations people were agreeing to in those agreements is, sort of the root of all the misunderstanding that's followed. The idea that you can't sell land that the Creator has given you because you're part of the land.
Right.
It's a really profound way of thinking, and an idea that I think is that it really changes your perspective on the entire country when you begin with that as your starting point.
Right. Right, it's true, and thank you for noting our contribution, although, I really think it was a mutual contribution, and you certainly gave us the options and direction or suggestions for different areas to talk about. Did you have difficulty narrowing some of the topics or the focus with respect to how you would present the treaties and the treaty relationship topic?
Well, one of the things that you have to quickly learn in the magazine business is that you can't tell all the stories. So you want to tell the stories that you can tell them well, and get the people who know the stories that can tell them well. And so we were really lucky that our process began by bringing in First Nations and Indigenous voices, scholars, historians, education experts. In that very first meeting that we had, when we had our sort of unofficial advisory council of people, and we sat around the table and we talked about treaties, and we talked about, remember, one of our very first conversations was literally the treaty relationship, and discussing ways of looking at the country. Do we look at it regionally? Do we look at it chronologically? Do we look at it thematically? There's so many places, starting off points to talk about treaties. In fact, I think Let's Talk Treaties is a great title because you could do that forever.
Right.
I mean, you're going to be able to have these conversations for many, many generations to come. But for us, I think it was really important to have a representation of the entire country, including areas that didn't have treaties, like, for instance, on the West Coast, some of these regions, and places in Ottawa where we deal with a story about people still trying to fight for recognition there after decades of being ignored by the federal government and provincial governments. And so, right from all coast to coast to coast, we have lots of interesting stories here, I think, and it's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what really is to come about stories.
And I think from the First Nations perspective, they would say everyone is still fighting, for the government to acknowledge them and recognize and to deal with their treaties. The magazine provided an opportunity for every individual to understand how different the treaties are across the country, right? And that there are different issues that are involved for First Nations people and the Crown across the country. So I'm certainly proud, and I know the Commission is proud to be a part of it. And you're right. I mean, you could talk about many things with respect to the treaties, and I think the magazine shows that. Right? We've just kind of touched the surface on a number of these, and we could have numerous magazines hereafter about different topics that come up from some of those articles that we've shared and that you've published, for sure. So how do you see now the magazine contributing to the ongoing dialogue between or about treaties and the treaty relationship?
Well, I think every day is a chance to get up and have another chance of doing things the right way and really sort of making sure that no matter what history we're talking about, that we actually look at it from multiple perspectives. We don't, we use, I guess, this experience to even build further relationship with First Nation writers and Indigenous writers. And because I think, one of the main things is to kind of get authentic voices in our magazine. We've had, since 1920, we've had many, many stories of non-Indigenous, non-First Nations people telling the stories of the Indigenous and First Nations people of the country. And I think, there's such a renaissance of writing, of just talented artists out there, musicians, actors, sculptors, that really, we want to be a conduit to get more of those voices out, because the more that we hear directly from the people who lived those stories through their grandparents and great-grandparents and others, I think that the more authentic and more real the conversation will be as we all talk about reconciliation, for instance.
Right.
You can't reconcile with people unless you first understand and walk a mile in their shoes, I think, and really that is our goal going forward. It's a conversation starter. Let's use this magazine to kick off countless conversations in the future that it will maybe help get us all in a direction we want to go.
So what did you find for yourself on this journey this past year in terms of understanding the treaties and the treaty relationship?
For me, what really sticks in my mind is that I was editing Corinne Duhamel's story, and she is the curator of Indigenous content at the Human Rights Museum here in Winnipeg. She's also of Anishinaabe and Métis descent, and she was writing about that whole concept of who are the parties in the treaty. Of course, it's the Europeans that were here and the First Nations and the Creator. And I remember just, contacting her afterwards because that was such an alien concept to me. I'd never heard that before.
Right.
And so, that opened up a whole dialogue. There's an entire article be written just on the notes back and forth by email of me asking questions and piquing my curiosity. Like, really, I've never thought about that before. And I think, to me, it's the benefit of this whole publication has been for you to look in the mirror and ask yourself, do I really know what I think I know?
Right.
And what don't I know? And why don't I know it? And I think if we can start answering those questions, and if the teachers and others who will take this publication and hopefully use it in their classrooms, they can help people like my kids' age understand this. And I think that'll give us the jumping off point for even more in-depth conversations with each other in the years to come.
And I know certainly at the Commission, through our Treaty Education Initiative, we will be using the magazine as we teach teachers how to teach treaties in the classroom, right? So there's life beyond the magazine for the articles and the magazine itself. So the one thing we haven't talked about yet is some of the contributors to the magazine itself. We've talked about your role and our role at the Treaty Commission office, but was it difficult to kind of select these writers to contribute to the magazine?
Well, obviously, we could do another 6 magazines with some of the voices out there, but I'm really proud of the people that we decided to move forward with at the end. And And I really think each writer brought to the table something unique. And, for instance, we have someone like Amy Kraft, who's an Anishinaabe Métis Indigenous lawyer and assistant professor, and just a legal expert. And she was able to kind of help us understand, I guess, the misunderstandings and even just the wording of the treaties.
Right.
And what people were thinking when they were saying things. We had, of course, Corinne Duhamel, who I mentioned, who just brings such a unique perspective from the Human Rights Museum, but also people like Goodnaya Labukan, a Cree biologist and lawyer and writer who wrote about the areas in BC that aren't covered by treaties, or Jaime Baptiste, who is leading treaty education in Nova Scotia. We have artists. Philip Cote co-wrote an article with Nathan Tidrich, who's actually a teacher of European descent. And so one of the other things I really loved about this project was some of the articles were co-written by Indigenous and First Nation and non-First Nation writers working together to sort through their ideas, challenge each other, and come up with a story that together is stronger than just the sum of the parts, if you will. That is really great, because that shows that it's not a story of one people talking at the other people and vice versa and saying, we will talk and you listen, or you talk and we listen. It's let's talk together. Let's listen to each other. Let's move forward and put these stories out there. And we have, university professors like Bill Wicken, and of course your amazing introduction at the beginning, which sets the tone for everything. And so what excites me about this project is being able to learn who else is out there. Yeah. Who are the other voices that we can find for the stories to come in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Are you in a position, or have you been getting any type of feedback with respect to the magazine? And if so, what kind of feedback are you getting?
Well, it's funny you say that, because I got a package in my office today. One of the things we did here in Winnipeg is there's a French language newspaper called La Liberté. It's produced in St. Boniface. And the editor of that publication helped us edit the French version, because this is available in English and in French.
That's right.
And so it was inserted in their newspaper as a free insert for people to read. And every day she has emailed me super excited, because her readers are eating it up. They love it.
Nice.
They think it's fantastic. They have never read this before.
Right.
Why weren't we told this in school?
Yes.
It makes so much more clearer today than it was yesterday in terms of what people are fighting for. And in fact, today a package came with some of the reactions, some of the letters in French from French readers reading it, and also the newspaper itself was so excited about the project. They wrote an editorial, a full-page editorial praising it, and also praising the treaty, and basically saying is that nobody ever will have the right to say, I don't know.
Right.
What is everybody upset about anymore? Because they have this resource that will help them understand, give them that basis of understanding going forward.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. That's so good to hear, because I know at the commission we sometimes feel we're alone talking about treaties and getting people to understand why the treaties are so important today, right? People always want to leave them in the past, but it's really a modern day issue in terms of the relationship and understanding the First Nation perspective. So I think that partnering with Canada's History magazine has done, just by what you're saying this morning or today, that it's gone a long way already to advance the education and awareness of treaties and treaty education. So now, where can we get a copy?
Well, we have a wonderful problem in that it's in such high demand. The English copies are actually gone. I mean, this is a free resource. We have French copies, but it's available online, and there may be a reprinting. So I'm going to give you two different ways to get them. One is a phone number. You can call Danielle in our office at 204-988 9300 extension 214, and just you can introduce yourself to her, and there's French copies available. However, online you can get canadashistory.ca/teaching treaties. There's an S in between. It's Canada S History, canadashistory.ca/teaching treaties, and the PDF is available in French and in English. And if people want to print it out, share it with their friends, put it on Facebook, tweet it, whatever. The more eyes that see the publication and read it and talk about it and share it, the better.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing this, and for the opportunity to work with you on what I think is a tremendous product and teaching tool for everyone. And so I look forward to maybe new partnerships in the future.
That's wonderful. I'm going to hold you to it. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. And so for our listening audience, we will have that same information on our website, so people can find ways to get the magazine online or to call Canada's History magazine If you've missed a previous episode of Let's Talk Treaty, I encourage you to download and check our website for previous broadcasts. And until then, I encourage everyone to continue to talk treaty. Miigwech.
Following.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back. That was a wonderful interview between Commissioner Loretta Ross and Canada's history editor, Mark Reid. So what we're going to do for the rest of this webinar, let's do a bit of a recap. Let's take away some of the main understandings that we got from Mark and Loretta, and let's apply them to what we have in our list of learning materials at the Treaty Education Initiative. So let's look at some of the main themes we heard Mark and Loretta talk about. We heard that we cannot understand the history of Canada without having an understanding of the history of treaties. They are part and parcel. Treaties are a Canadian story. We heard that everybody benefits from an understanding of how treaties were created, the different perspectives, and how the numbered treaties today are living documents, and other treaties, not just the numbered treaties. We heard Mark talk about how it's important to consider how we know what we think we know. We heard that treaties are not just a land exchange. You can't sell land the Creator has given you, and Mark emphasized this a couple times. We learned that there are different treaties and different relationships across the country. In some areas of Canada, there are no treaties. We also heard that the story of treaties is not a one-person story. Rather, it is a story where people talk and listen to each other. This relationship is key to Canada and reconciliation. Before we get into the lesson plans and the learning activities, let's just take a look at the magazine issue that Mark and Commissioner Ross were talking about. You can see the magazine issue on the left. That's the actual cover of the magazine. And you can see the really interesting articles that were written and are part of the special magazine. You heard Commissioner Ross and editor Mark Reid say that this is a national look at the treaty relationship. So we are looking at the treaty relationship across Canada, not just the Manitoba experience. You can see the article called We Are All Treaty People by Corinne Duhamel. You heard Mark talk about Corinne. Interpreting Treaties. Ties of Kinship looks at the Treaty of Niagara, which is obviously east of us here in Manitoba. The Numbered Treaties, written by Cynthia Bird. Cynthia Bird is a co-author of the Treaty Education Initiative learning materials, and Cynthia is an integral leader in the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. Amy Kraft, Living Well Together. Algonquin, what is the experience, the treaty experience in places like the Ottawa Valley? Nations in Waiting, you can see on page 46. This is the BC treaty experience. And Finding Forgiveness and Building Trust. So again, this is a glimpse. You heard Mark talk about the issue. The issue itself has sold out. It is available online though. You can actually download the entire magazine, or you can download individual articles. You also heard, Mark, that the magazine was a partnership between the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba and Canada's history. And the foreword and the guest editor was Commissioner Ross. And you can see it. The article that Loretta wrote is fantastic. And I mean, myself as a longtime high school teacher, these are wonderful opportunities to engage with your students about the national relationship centered on treaties here in Canada. So let's move in a bit. Let's move in. What we're going to do now for the next little while, we're going to look at 3 learning activities, 3 lesson plans that reach back to our understanding. That reach back to our understanding that we heard Commissioner Ross and Mark Reid talk about. We're going to look at a grade 2 lesson plan. We are going to look at a grade 4 lesson plan. And we are going to look at a grade 9 lesson plan. Before we get into the minutiae of the pedagogy, I want to remind everybody, and teachers know this, lesson plans are a guide. They're an opportunity, they're a nub of creativity for you to take it and run with it in your class. This might be in a grade 2 document. You could certainly use it in grade 10. It's up to you. I mean, teachers, you are the cook, right? I always say that a lesson plan is the recipe. You're the chef. So let's look. Some of the things we learned in this episode is We cannot understand the history of Canada without having an understanding of the history of treaties. The stories of treaties is not a one-person story. Rather, it's a story where people talk and listen to each other. This relationship is key to Canada and reconciliation. So let's take a look at our grade 2 lesson plan. All our lesson plans follow the same format. They start, and you can see this on your left, with an overview of the concept and a background to the concept. So the background to the concept is written for you teachers. It's going to help you approach this topic with your students. This lesson is called the Treaty Community, Building Our Treaty Community. So the takeaway is that we are all part of this treaty relationship. Whether we are a First Nations person living on a First Nations reserve, whether we are living in the city of Winnipeg, we are all part of this treaty relationship. So what this starts off with, like all our lessons, it goes through the phases of lessons: activate, acquire, apply. It starts off with, again, this is a grade 2 lesson, are all Canadians treaty people? We hear this tagline, we are all treaty people. What does that mean? So the kids start off by looking at that. Okay? The kids start off. The concept that I introduced you to a bit on the last page, it says the treaty community is a concept that all Canadians need to embrace as we move forward in building a nation that is knowledgeable of treaties. Treaties were created as a result of two nations establishing an agreement to benefit both partners. As more Canadians gain a sense of awareness that as members of the treaty community, they share a responsibility to respect and honor the treaties. Treaties are a gift, okay, for our grandchildren and children, and it's for all Canadians. So that's the overarching entry point, the theme of this lesson. Grade 2. What you start off with, and you can see the lesson plan here, I'm not going to read it all in all its details to you. You start off. How are you going to prepare the students? The first thing you do is actually you get the kids into pairs and you give them each a blown up balloon. Now the activity here is a kinesthetic one, obviously. They have to pass the balloon back and forth, but they can't use their hands. So I don't know whether you encourage them to use their knees or their elbows or their heads. And when they're all finished, let them do this for a while. Let them bounce the balloon around in pairs and then ask them, what did you need to do to get the job done? How did you guys figure out how to pass this balloon back and forth, back and forth? Okay? When you're finished, have a discussion with the kids. Put it on the smart board or the whiteboard. What did you need to do? And lead the discussion. And hopefully it comes out we had to cooperate. We had to figure out a way together, right? We had to communicate. We had to give suggestions. We had to agree. So this is a grade 2 lesson. Have the kids understand that to go forward in a good way, you have to build a community and you have to communicate. It actually goes on now, is the students, you start off with the balloon activity. This is your activating activity. Now you're going to spend some time looking at treaties and the treaty relationship. The end of the activity, moving from acquire to apply, is actually having the kids create a treaty chain. Have them linked together and reinforce at the very end how the treaty community was made by people working together in cooperation. So that's the intent of this lesson. This is a grade 2 lesson. Again, I could easily see myself using this in a grade 11 class. I would just have different assessment, right? I've used balloons in my class before in grade 11 and grade 12. That was a grade 2 lesson. I told you today we're going to look at a grade 2, a grade 4, and a grade 9. So let's take a look. What you see in front of you right now comes from our grade 4 document. The grade 4 document is called First Nations in Manitoba, and it aligns succinctly with the grade 4 social studies. We heard Mark and we heard Commissioner Ross say something to the effect of it's important to consider how do we know what we know. And what this lesson does, this is a grade 4 lesson. It starts on page 36 in the grade 4 document. Topic 2.2, teaching stories about values, respect, and sharing. How do we know about the past? So this lesson walks students, and again, I would encourage you to use this in any grade, through looking at sources of history. How do we know about the past? How do we know? The past is a story, right? But how, to today, how do we know what happened before? We heard actually Mark talk about typically in the past, Indigenous First Nations history was written by non-Indigenous people. But what we do with this lesson now, we start off simply, and here's your lesson, and I'm clicking it in front of you. You start the lesson off by literally asking kids, how do we know about stuff a long time ago? Before you were born, before your granny was born, before Kukum was born, before your mom was born. How do you know? What you end up doing is you're encouraged to bring in examples of sources. Historians rely on sources. We rely on primary sources. These are firsthand evidence of the past, right? So we're looking at something like a letter, a photograph, a journal, a painting, something that is an eyewitness to the past. That historians call those primary sources. You're asked as a teacher to bring in and circulate this within the class. A secondary source. A secondary source in history is about history, typically a book, an encyclopedia. I mean, I could write an article about Treaty 1. Treaty 1 was signed in 1871. I wasn't there, but I can write about it. Primary sources, secondary sources. Historians also piece together the past based on something called artifacts. And these are basically the physical objects from the past. Find something old in your house and bring it around to your classroom and circulate it in class. And have a discussion. What primary sources did I share with you? Maybe I brought photographs. Maybe I bought a letter. Maybe I bought a journal entry. Maybe I bought a sketch. What secondary sources did I share in class? Maybe it was a textbook. Maybe it was an article. What artifacts did I bring? Whatever you happen to bring at home. So this is the first two parts of the activity. So now the kids, and this is grade 4, the kids have a grasp of how we have to piece things together, and there is interpretation inlaid in all of these as well. Now what you do, you move the kids into another way we know about the past, and the crux of the lesson now is to focus on oral history. Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, since time immemorial, used oral history to relay our past. So the kids look at that. You can do two things now as this lesson progresses. We want to focus now on the importance of oral tradition. You can do two things. You can invite an elder, a storyteller, into your classroom. Perhaps you have an elder as part of your school board. Perhaps you access an elder from the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba Speakers Bureau. Or if you can't access an elder or a storyteller, we actually have a website. There's quite a few online called firstnationsteachings.com. You can go online and you can actually access stories. And you have the kids listen. And you can see I just clipped up a little sheet that has the kids summarize what they heard. So at the end of the lesson, the students have explored, how do we know what we know? How do we know what we know? That's the grade 4 lesson. I told you today we were going to look at grade 2, grade 4, and you can see grade 9. Grade 9, our theme and our entry point based on the Let's Talk Treaty episode is there are different treaties and different relationships across the country. In some areas of Canada, there are no treaties. Here in Manitoba, the lands that we call Manitoba today are covered by several of the numbered treaties. If you're in Winnipeg right now, it's Treaty 1. If you're in Swan River right now, it's Treaty 4. I'm visiting you today from the Paw. This is Treaty 5 territory. There are some areas of Canada where there are no treaties, and that is what this grade 9 lesson plan explores. It is topic 4.1. The treaty experience in British Columbia. There's a unique treaty experience. So what you do in this lesson, you actually explore this with the kids. You explore the treaty experience in BC as a different experience to our experience here in the province of Manitoba. This is an information sheet that I clipped right from the lesson plan itself. The numbered treaties signed between 1871 and 1921 are evergreen. They are lasting documents with relevance today. Treaties benefit all Canadians. 2 parties are required to make a treaty, with both parties having obligations and benefits that derive from the treaty. In Manitoba, the treaties contain benefits for both settlers and First Nations peoples. First Nations peoples received annuities, education, reserves, as well as farming assistance. Settlers received access to farmland and resources, as well as the peace and goodwill of First Nations people. In this way, we are all treaty people. The BC Treaty experience is unique in that it is a modern exercise. Both First Nations peoples and non-First Nations peoples in British Columbia do and will continue to benefit from the treaty relationship. So what you do, you actually spend some time comparing the treaty relationship here in our province of Manitoba with British Columbia. You can see in the left, the lesson plan actually has a link to a wonderful video from the BC Treaty Commission. You use the video, you have a fulsome discussion with your class, and when you're finished, there's no template. You let the kids be creative, list the benefits of the treaty relationship for First Nations and not First Nations in British Columbia. Give the chart a title, compare the experience between BC and here in Manitoba, and, give it a title. You can call it We Are All Treaty People. That's a grade 9 one. This episode of our webinar series, as you know, has been focused on the treaties and the treaty relationship special publication. You can see it there, Canada's History. If you also want some other materials based on the magazine, there is online, you can find it, a separate set of learning activities for the magazine that was created in consultation with the Treaty Relations Commission, with us, and teachers from across the country. So do some digging around online and you'll actually find more materials that support the teaching of treaties and the treaty relationship in your classroom. At the same time, I just thought I'd let you guys know that this is not the first time the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba has had the wonderful opportunity of partnering with Canada's National History Society. Our partnership resulted in the magazine that we've been focusing on for the last while, but we also partnered with Canada's History Society on a webinar series. You can see some of the webinars here. Treaty Making and the Significance of the Royal Proclamation, Reflections on Making of Treaty 1, a geographical perspective on the numbered treaties. You can access these webinars hosted by Canada's History Society on our website, www.trcm.ca. And with that, folks, on behalf of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba and the Treaty Education team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our Using Let's Talk Treaty in the Classroom webinar. Please visit the TRCM website for other webinars and materials to help you teach treaties in the classroom.